Imagine this: you're fast asleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer to your home. A shadow moving silently in the darkness, watching your every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But you don't know it yet. You're just one of many targets in a terrifying crime spree, one that will send shockwaves through an entire community. For months, this unseen predator stalked the night, leaving families shattered and afraid, but without a single clue to his identity. Doors were left ajar, windows slightly open, and homes were ransacked, but there was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no trace of the criminal. It was as if this man, or whatever he was, could vanish without a trace, slipping in and out of people's homes without a sound. And yet, he left behind something far more haunting than missing valuables. He left fear, fear so deep it consumed the entire neighborhood. Who was behind these crimes? How did they manage to remain invisible for so long? The police were baffled. With no leads, no pattern, no obvious motive, they were forced to confront the horrifying reality. Someone was out there, moving through their town, unseen and untouchable. With each passing day, the tension grew. Could this figure be stopped before he struck again? Or were they facing something far more terrifying than anyone could imagine? This is the story of an investigation that began with nothing but fear and confusion. A story of a relentless pursuit of a shadow in the night. A story where the truth and the person behind the terror would not be revealed until it was almost too late. For weeks, the small suburban community of Willowbrook was in the grip of an unseen terror. At first, it seemed like an ordinary string of burglaries, but when the break-ins began to escalate, something far more sinister emerged. People started locking their doors and windows tighter, but it didn't matter. The shadow came anyway, and with each crime, the unease spread like wildfire. No one knew who to trust, no one knew where to turn. They only knew one thing: they weren't safe. It began innocently enough. A couple of reports of homes being broken into while the families slept. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. The burglar simply slipped inside, quietly ransacking valuables, leaving behind a sense of violation more than anything else. The police chalked it up to a clever thief, someone skilled at entering homes unnoticed. But then it happened again, and again. The patterns were odd. The break-ins weren't random. The thief was selective, choosing families who were deeply entrenched in the neighborhood's daily life. No quick cash grabs. This wasn't just about stealing property. This was about something far darker. But the most unsettling thing? The families didn't know they were victims until the next morning. They'd wake up to discover their homes had been quietly invaded in the dead of night. It was as if the intruder knew exactly when and where to strike, and then disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing but confusion in his wake. A sense of dread began to spread. As the weeks passed, it was clear the criminal was no longer just a thief. He was a predator, and he had a taste for the fear he was creating. For some, the fear was palpable. The seemingly perfect neighborhood, once filled with laughter and children playing in the yards, now felt empty. Families locked themselves in at night, blinds drawn, afraid to sleep. People began talking in hushed whispers, speculating. Could it be someone local? Could it be someone they knew? Each new break-in brought more questions and fewer answers. The police had little to go on. The suspect left no trace, no fingerprints, no DNA. There was no physical evidence to even suggest who might be behind the terrifying spree. Yet each new victim described the same chilling feeling, that they were being watched. A sense of invisible eyes upon them, eyes that were always there, always waiting. The intruder never showed his face. But in the quiet of their homes, the residents knew he was close. They just didn't know how close. It didn't take long before the fears started to ripple outward. beyond the immediate victims. People who had never been directly affected started double-locking their doors, avoiding street corners at night, and making sure their children were always inside after dark. No one was safe. No one felt safe. One by one, families began to speak out. Victim after victim shared similar stories of strange noises in the night, of creeping footsteps just outside their windows, of the eerie feeling that something was wrong before they even realized they'd been targeted. But still, no one knew who to point the finger at. They couldn't even be sure what they were dealing with. Was this a desperate thief, or something far more calculating, more terrifying? There were whispers of a shadow, an unknown figure who moved through the community like a ghost, carefully selecting his targets. Some wondered if the figure was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. No one knew, but one thing was clear. Willowbrook was no longer the quiet, peaceful town it once was. It was a place gripped by fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that an invisible predator was lurking just beyond their doors. As the weeks turned into months, the fear that had consumed Willowbrook spread throughout the entire police department. Detectives were at a loss. Each break-in, each new report from the terrified residents seemed to lead nowhere. For every door they knocked on, every lead they followed, they found themselves back at square one. The man, or whatever he was a ghost. No one could explain how the intruder moved so freely through the homes, evading detection. No one could understand why there were no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints, no hair, no footprints, no trace. It was as if the thief had simply appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. And yet the residents could feel his presence growing closer. They weren't just worried about their valuables. This was more than just theft. People were becoming emotionally scarred, their sense of security shattered beyond repair. Some even claimed they could hear footsteps at night, feel the air shift as if someone was watching from just outside their windows. It was becoming clear that the community wasn't dealing with a common criminal. They were dealing with someone who knew how to instill fear. Detective Mark Reynolds, one of the lead investigators, couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary crime spree. It was personal. At first, the break-ins appeared random, but as the cases piled up, Reynolds began to notice subtle connections between the homes that had been targeted. Families with young children, single mothers, homes where the doors were always unlocked, where people left windows open at night. He had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't a simple crime of opportunity. This intruder was carefully planning his moves. He was watching. He was waiting. But why? Reynolds and his team began retracing their steps, re-examining every piece of evidence, looking for a clue, a connection that had been missed in their previous investigations. They pored over every surveillance camera in the area, hoping for a break, and finally, something appeared. A grainy image from a security camera at a local convenience store. The footage showed a man, hooded, wearing a dark jacket, walking briskly down the street at around 2 a.m., the same time as several of the break-ins. The image was blurry, but the unmistakable pattern of the figure moving with purpose sent a chill down the investigators' spines. It was the first tangible lead they had. It wasn't much, but it was something. Detective Reynolds took the footage to his team, and they began to analyze it for any clues about the man's identity. They enhanced the image, scrutinized the way he walked, the way he carried himself. Nothing about the man stood out. He wasn't tall. He wasn't overly muscular. He didn't have a distinctive gait, but the cold precision with which he moved, like a predator hunting its prey, was chilling. They knew they were dealing with someone methodical, someone who wasn't just trying to steal. He was playing a game, but the question remained, who was he, and why was he targeting these specific homes? As the investigation progressed, Reynolds' team expanded their search, reaching out to neighboring towns, speaking with officers in nearby districts. And that's when they uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the investigation. The same pattern of break-ins had been reported in other communities. It was the same MO, the same lack of forced entry, the same eerie silence, and most disturbingly, the same sense of fear that lingered long after the criminal had disappeared. The investigation was quickly turning into a full-scale manhunt. As more resources were brought in, the police began canvassing neighborhoods more aggressively, knocking on doors, interviewing potential witnesses, and trying to track down anyone who might have seen something suspicious. The pressure on the police department was mounting. The community was demanding answers. But the shadow remained elusive. Every lead seemed to fizzle out. There were reports of a man seen walking near one of the targeted houses, but no one could identify him. Another tip came in about a neighbor who had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked late at night, but the car was gone by the time police arrived. Nothing seemed to connect the dots. The fear that had plagued the community now began to morph into frustration. Residents, desperate for answers, began to take matters into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed in the middle of the night, patrolling the streets with flashlights, scanning their neighbors' homes for anything out of the ordinary. Some even went so far as to suggest that the police were incompetent, that they were too slow to catch the man who had ruined their lives. The rumors began to swirl. Maybe the police knew more than they were letting on. Maybe there was a conspiracy to cover up the true identity of the thief. But Detective Reynolds wasn't about to let the case slip away. Late one night, as he sat in the office staring at a wall of case files, he noticed something peculiar. An old unsolved case from 2 years earlier. A similar series of break-ins in another town about 40 miles away. The details were strikingly familiar. Homes broken into while families slept. The same subtle, unsettling pattern. Could the two cases be connected? The breakthrough came when Reynolds connected the name of a man linked to the previous break-ins. His name, Gabriel Myers, a name that would soon become known to the entire nation. The manhunt was now intensifying. The clock was ticking, and in the shadows the predator was still watching, still waiting to strike again. As the investigation raged on, with each passing day feeling like a race against time, Detective Reynolds found himself consumed by a single question. Who was behind this reign of terror? Who could move so carefully, so methodically, with such a chilling disregard for the lives he was upending? But every step closer to the truth seemed to bring with it more questions and fewer answers. It wasn't until the breakthrough came, through the meticulous work of Reynolds' team, that the shadows finally began to lift. The breakthrough didn't come from a new witness or a fresh lead, but from a connection, a name from the past. 2 years earlier, in a neighboring town, a string of eerily similar break-ins had occurred. Homes were targeted during the night, with the same precision, the same lack of physical evidence. The break-ins had been unsolved until now. Reynolds, in his desperation, had gone through the files of older cases, looking for patterns, any anomaly that could shed light on the present case. That's when he found it. A name buried deep in the reports, Gabriel Myers. Myers had been arrested 2 years earlier for a string of petty thefts, but had quickly slipped through the cracks of the criminal justice system. He was released after serving only a short sentence. But there was something about him, something unnerving, that had stuck with the officers who had been involved in those earlier investigations. Myers had never been violent, but there was a disturbing coldness to him, a meticulousness in the way he approached his crimes. When Reynolds and his team dug deeper, they uncovered more about Gabriel Myers. He was a quiet man, never married, never had much of a social life. He was a ghost in his community, an unassuming figure who blended in, never raising suspicion. He had worked odd jobs, moving from place to place, always on the periphery of society. But it was clear now that Myers had a darker side. He had been practicing his craft long before the break-ins in Willowbrook. He had honed his skills, and now his crimes had escalated. With the name confirmed, Reynolds and his team turned their focus to tracking down Myers. They scoured the area, working tirelessly to locate him. They knew they were running out of time. The pressure was mounting, not just from the community, but from the media. The public demanded answers. But for every lead they chased, Myers always seemed one step ahead. Then, just when it seemed like he had vanished into thin air, the tip came in. A local convenience store worker, who had seen Myers on the surveillance footage weeks earlier, reported seeing a man matching his description once again, walking down a dark street at night. It was a long shot, but it was enough. The task force moved in quickly, surrounding the area where Myers had been spotted. The search was intense, but the police were ready. They knew they were close, and this time, they weren't going to let him slip away. The operation was carried out under the cover of darkness, a fitting strategy for a man who had always operated in the shadows. At 2 a.m., in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, Gabriel Myers was finally cornered. His capture wasn't dramatic. There were no standoffs, no gunfire. The man who had terrorized Willowbrook and so many other communities surrendered quietly, as though he had known the end was near. Myers' arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who had lived in constant fear now felt a sense of relief, though it was bittersweet. For many, it was difficult to comprehend that the man who had caused so much pain was just an ordinary man. A man who had been hiding in plain sight, living among them for years without ever raising suspicion. As Myers was taken into custody, the full extent of his crimes began to unravel. He wasn't just a thief, he had been a stalker, a predator who had methodically planned his every move. His victims had been carefully selected, not for what they owned, but for the fear he knew he could instill in them. It was never about the stolen items, it was about the terror, the power he held over his victims as they lay asleep, unaware of the danger lurking in the night. In the weeks that followed, investigators learned more about Myers' chilling behavior. He had a history of meticulous planning. He would scout his victims weeks in advance, watching them, learning their routines. When he struck, it wasn't just for money. It was for control, for dominance. He thrived in the darkness, in the quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, when his victims were most vulnerable. Gabriel Myers had been a shadow in every sense of the word, an invisible force that moved unseen through the lives of his victims. Now, the shadow had been exposed, and though he was behind bars, the scars he left on Willowbrook would last far longer.